It's my very great pleasure to be speaking to Paul Tyson today. Paul, I only heard of you very recently. There was a gentleman I know online. His name is Jonathan McCormack. And Jonathan, if you're listening, thank you so much. He was aware that I'm quite interested in the scholars known as the Radical Orthodoxy movement, otherwise known as the Cambridge School, who are basically Christian Platonists. And he recommended your work, and I started poring over your academic articles. I bought a book of yours here, embarrassing number of tabs on the side there, if you just ignore them. It's called Defragmenting Modernity. Absolutely amazing book. If your other books are as good as this, I highly recommend that everyone immediately, as soon as you finish listening to this, go and buy one of Paul's books, because there was just gold dripping off every page. I'm not exaggerating, just to flatter Paul here. It was very eye-opening. So, Paul, I've given you a sort of introduction there. Perhaps you could talk a bit about yourself. What is it that you do? Where do you live? Who are you?
Thanks, Richard. It's lovely to be talking to you. So I live in Australia. The bottom of the world is probably the best place to be at the moment. We've managed to avoid most of the plague by just being a long, long way away from everyone. I'm a research scholar at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Humanities at the University of Queensland, and I'm working on a science and religion project that's Templeton funded over the next year. It's been going for 2 years, and it's really good fun working with some very fine people. So Peter Harrison is a historian of modern science here at the University of Queensland. Top class guy, did the Gifford lectures a few years back, and he wrote a great little book called The Territories of Science and Religion, just talking about the incredible way in which science became one thing and religion became another thing in the 19th century. It's very recent. And now we've got this problem of whether these two different territories are at war, whether they overlap, or whether they're doing different things. But the problem is defining the territories, really. So the project I'm doing with people like John Milbank, David Bentley Hart, Charles Taylor, Catherine Pickstock, just a really good bunch of really fun people, William Desmond, really nice people, are trying to think after science and religion. So we're trying to think outside of those territorial boundaries. What is the relationship between knowledge and higher meaning? So I'm just having a ball. It's so much fun.
Oh, I can
so
imagine.
I'm a professional fun.
I mean, just the names that you've just mentioned there, I mean, it must be exhilarating to be working with these people. And I'm generally surprised that more people don't know about radical orthodoxy. I mean, we live at a time when, especially young people online, they're so ready to critique modernity. And I'm not just talking about from the typical postmodern perspective of being skepticist and deconstructing language, etc., etc. I mean, just to, well, you call them in your book the cultural pathologies that we have from modernity, and this changed way, this way that our thinking has changed, from certainly from the classical world and the medieval world into modernity. And I think young people are becoming increasingly aware of this, the dehumanizing feeling that they see all the time. They might not be able to articulate it quite as well as certainly you have, or the Radical Orthodoxy movement is trying to do. But I mean, they are aware of these cultural pathologies. They see it when they go to a shopping mall, for instance. Wherever they are in the world, the shopping mall will be exactly the same. It's a very dehumanizing experience. And I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
I mean, is that how you feel? Are you quite surprised that more people don't know about Radical Orthodoxy?
Yes, I think it's becoming a pretty obvious sort of position to take. Like it's getting much more airplay. How do I put this? So, like this little book here that you like, fragmentation is a big problem. How we can't integrate wisdom and knowledge, And we can't do that because we like them separated and enables us to do certain things. And there are some really good bonuses to it, okay? So if we just say science is only about an instrumental control of things you can measure and touch and see, then you don't have to worry about whether it's particularly right or wrong, or whether it means anything or means something bad. If you can do it, it's science. And so we've got this really can-do technological instrumental power, and we really like it. It does a lot of great things, builds roads, gets your satellites into the space, does all sorts of incredible things that we like. And I'm really glad for things like penicillin and all those benefits that go with that. But it's got a cost that we just have not really got the ability to calculate or pay if we don't know that this is not the only way you can do reality. So the problem is a kind of a blinkered view of what's real. And it's never been this kind of reductive, instrumental, factual, material view of what's real is great at what it's good at, but it's never been an adequate answer for everything. And it's just so overly balanced. It's so like you've got this huge right arm and this tiny left arm that we're out of balance in terms of making sense of our world. And when we try and fix it with just heavier right arm power, it just makes the problem worse. So a recovery of a deeper wisdom tradition that's part of the Western way of thinking is we've kind of lost a lot of that in the last, really since the 1870s, probably the 1840s. And can I do advertising here?
Oh yeah, absolutely, please. Plug away.
So, I wonder if you can see that one. Kierkegaard's Theological Sociology is about the 1840s. It's about a time when we could have had a theological sociology, but instead we took a Marxist sociology. And we had a way of thinking about the meaning of being human in society that was reductively materialist, and that's just completely overridden the academy in the last 150 years. The process from the 1870s to the 1970s is this erosion of the older traditions of a theological undergirding to our understanding of society and power and ethics and knowledge. And so the academy bears a lot of blame for what's gone wrong, even though we do like to look at what's great about it. But the fact is we've got enormous knowledge and power, but no wisdom to direct it, and no real way of understanding things like purpose and meaning. So I'll give you another. I've got 5 books here, but I'll just plug these ones.
Absolutely.
So this one, 7 Brief Lessons on Magic, is my attempt at writing in the same genre as Ravelli's little book, 7 Brief Lessons on Physics. And talking about those things that science can't see. And it's really John Milbank's argument, but in a much more easier language than John Milbank. So John Milbank is really good value if you are prepared to really torture yourself over every sentence. It's very rewarding, but not everybody can do it. So
you need degrees in all sorts of things, I think, to understand John Milbank. And I don't mean to say anything bad about John Milbank. He is
no, but his problem is he just knows everything.
Absolutely, he's just too good, if I can put it like that. And I mean, that is what I loved about this book. I mean, you put the arguments which I've spent a long time trying to get my head around, made by figures like John Milbank, Catherine Pickstock. But you put it in much simpler language. I mean, for instance, just now you were talking about, well, what is the problem with modernity? And you put it so brilliantly in your book. You say, well, effectively, we're overemphasizing the quantia, quantity, things we can measure, what we can measure with empirical data, and that's become really the only guiding force for power for our elites now. And certainly since the Protestant revolt, Protestant Reformation, belief, public belief, what we're acknowledging together as a culture, to be objectively true, things like love, goodness, beauty, truth, these qualia, the qualities, we've abandoned them. So we're overemphasizing the quantia, and we're just dismissing really as being of objective importance, of being part of a public creed that we might have, all of the
Yes.
qualia. But this is bizarre, because I mean that's not really how people behave. It's not really how humans behave. It's not even how modern humans behave. We treat each other as though we have meaning, and we have to. It's inescapable. We must behave as though the cosmos around us has some meaning, some comprehensibility, and our language the same, even before we engage in discourse in the first place. I thought you put it so well in your book. I don't know if you want to add anything there.
Yeah, no, it's kind of an obvious thing to say, but it's meaning that gives life meaning, you know. And so, and it's fascinating. I don't know if you've heard of Agamben's sort of recent comments on the COVID-19 crisis, but he talks about, well, this is an example of naked life. The idea that only those things you could tangibly measure and physically see matter. So just keeping people alive is the only thing that matters. And whatever needs to be shut down to keep people alive, that's what we should do. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm glad to take, precautions against plague. But he's got a really good point that we don't have a concept of what makes things meaningful and worthwhile other than bare life. And that's just a factive quanta rather than a qualitative understanding of life. It's an extremely impoverished view of what life is. So, for example, going to church is not an essential service, right? But going shopping is. Going to the hardware shop in Australia is an essential service.
Or the liquor
Getting
store,
a haircut is an
it
essential
is.
service, right?
Or going to the
going
liquor
to church
store.
in Holy Week, going to Holy Week, church in Holy Week, not essential at all. Nobody does it. And the thing that amazed me is the churches all said, okay, we're not essential. It doesn't matter. So
Yes,
we've got a very deep-seated problem, even within our people of faith, to accept this very quantitative view of what makes life meaningful. And that's profoundly philosophical and sociological. It's not simply ideological in any naive sense. So you've got to do the hard work in understanding where we got philosophically and theologically to this point if you're going to even identify the problem. So that's the kind of work I try and do, and I try to. So I'm not a first order thinker like John Milbank, but I'm a communicator to try and understand the kind of categories that he's working with for people who can't sit down and read theology and social theory, which took me 3 months to read. It was worth every struggled sentence of it, but you have to be a particular type of freak to have that sort of time available. So.
Well, you are a freak. You're a wonderful freak, and you've done such a very good job, I would say, in summarising the thinking of radical orthodoxy. I mean, yes. What can I say? I agree with you entirely. I mean, especially we need to have. And as you say, it's a shame that the church is not upholding a cultural framework, which is something we need. I mean, we need to have the values in the first place with which to hold our elites accountable. Otherwise, again, as you put it so brilliantly, otherwise we don't have any meaning, any value, anything with which to direct the state. The state is simply directed by the principle of power. And something else that you said is, well, yes. I mean, it's a good excuse, isn't it? Really, but it becomes
it's just another word for power.
Yeah, absolutely, yes, and technology then becomes the means to achieving it. There's something very Gnostic about the modern state. I've written about this myself. I mean, the goal of modernity, it seems to be, okay, yes, there's power. The main principle of it all is accumulating more and more power. To what end? Well, we don't really need to know. We're just progressing in that direction. Don't ask too many questions. Um, but if there is a sort of guiding light to it, as they would perceive it, if there is something benevolent about it, it's about so freeing man to determine privately his own meaning, his own belief, which is really at the heart of modernity's conception of man, so individualistic like that. Um, it's so about freeing man in that sense. It's about even freeing man from nature. And I mean, we see this. We see this in the fantasies of modernity and post-modernity, where there's, well, I mean, transhumanism, for instance, this idea that we're going to, through technology, even transcend our biological selves and take control of our own evolution, or become part of a singularity where we're just sort of absorbed into some sort of supercomputer or something like that. Um, I mean, this kind of very inhumane dream becomes the dream of modernity. I don't know whether you would share my thoughts there, or maybe think something a little bit different.
Very, very much. So it struck me through this COVID thing has been very helpful to sort of clarify a number of issues. How comfortable my fellow Christians in Australia seem to be with Gnosticism. So what I mean by a Gnostic spiritual sensibility is this idea that somehow my faith and my religion is a private and personal thing. It's not a public thing. And it's about some hereafter rather than the here and now. So we want to escape the body. And the only thing that matters to us in terms of religion is freedom to believe whatever we personally want to believe. And provided people leave us alone, we do our thing. And then we're happy, right? This, the way in which church just accepted its shutdown, it's illegal to go to church, right? And that's when it's okay to go to the hardware shop, provided you do certain precautions, right? But there's no question about doing precautions at the church. You just can't go, right? And we take this as obvious because it's going to be, a lot of old people go to church, and which is an important issue. But nonetheless, we accept this idea that religion is discrete from politics and physical life, and that's the Gnostic move. And this is the Gnostic salvation as well that you get in the transhumanists. We're going to get into some virtual other state and leave the icky body behind. And so the icky bodiness of communion, the icky bodiness of tasting and sharing and being gathered together into one body, right? The physicality of the gathering of the church. And the body metaphor, right? It's very uncomfortable to a modern religious sensibility. And in Australia, we have a Christian Prime Minister who, for all, I don't know him personally, okay, but he's a Pentecostal guy and very public about his faith when he wants to be, but it's totally discrete from his pragmatic concept of power. And he will do whatever is practically needed, and the fact that he's got deep personal religious convictions is great for coming across as someone you can trust. But that's as far as it goes, really. And so there's this capacity to fragment the spiritual from the physical is what I understand as Gnosticism. And we're in a high age of Gnosticism. And it also goes with this separation of science from religion. I think it's profoundly troubling. And I know you understand this, but I think medievalists help us a great deal in in getting a bit of a view on ourselves and how strange we are. If you can get into understanding the medieval outlook to some extent, and then try and look back on modernity, all of a sudden we look very, very strange. And there's a great deal that can be taught to us by I'm going to say Thomistic. So I'm an Augustinian Thomist in philosophically and theologically in many regards, and the way in which there is a transcendence and yet it's fully embodied and public, and knowledge and power and belief are all integrated in that outlook, and we've kind of separated them all out, and we've got this totally fragmented understanding of what it means to be human, and we've got a very amoral sense of power and a very meaningless sense of purpose, if we have a sense of purpose at all, really. So we've lost two of Aristotle's four causes. Am I jumping around too much? I probably am.
Probably. I mean, I'm finding it fascinating, but yeah, you're quite right. We've got to go step by step with this, because there's such a lot to take on board, and it's precisely because of what you've said, and I couldn't agree with you more. This affects everything. This affects the entire way we perceive the world. It really is to enter an alien world and a completely alien mindset. Your mind really has to change to get into the classical way of thinking, which continued on into the medieval period. In the sense that you have to come to terms with the fact that, I mean, even the Romans are very often held up as being a very secular, or not really having an overarching belief system and things like that. This is really cherry picking, I think, from modern, academia. But they couldn't conceive of the world outside of the mythos. Sorry, carry on, Paul.
Okay, you're kind of jumping a bit through the Zoom. We are on the other side of the world, so.
Oh yeah, sorry. If you lose me for a moment, then just let me know.
Well, I just wanted to say I was looking for a book on my shelf here, which I can't stick my hand on at the moment. It's a beautiful little book by Shannon Ross called "Gifts Glittering and Poisoned." And it's, which is a quote from William Desmond, amazing guy, I love William. And it's about an Augustinian view of the spectacle culture. And it looks at the mass media through Augustine's analysis of the arena. And so what I'm trying to say is this is not that I'm interested, is directly relevant. The idea that classical and medieval thinking is only for the kind of hobbyists who are interested in the past couldn't be further from the radical orthodox kind of or ressourcement sort of movement. So the idea is that we have lost certain key treasures, which has produced a kind of imbalance in the modern world. And if we want to save the modern world, we have to restore a balance to it, which we can only find by looking at the sources of where things became imbalanced and what options there are back there to do things differently now. So the interest in the past is very much focused on trying to understand the shopping mall. And yes. So that's where my guys are coming from. And yes. I'm pretty sure it's the same sort of perspective that you have.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm trying to write currently about what the changes were, the philosophical, the theological changes which occurred in the medieval period, which then, sent us off at this tangent whereby we've arrived at modernity, which is so very different, so very alien to Christendom
Yes.
before, and the classical world before that, particularly in the area of law, because that's what I'm interested in. I mean, however, it's inescapable, really. I find myself having to deal with the whole gamut of philosophical changes that have occurred. Um, Particularly, I find in Radical Orthodoxy, there are a number of thinkers who are addressed, and the changes that they brought about in their thinking are seen as being very significant, and I would tend to agree. So, one who isn't mentioned as much is Peter of Abelard. I'm probably massacring his name there, but I
No,
mean,
no, no.
he began a way of thinking which was, well, it's okay to doubt until you've got enough evidence and you've reasoned it through enough that then you can believe it. Even with something like that, I find that betrays how we actually think and how we actually are in the world, which is that we innately have a belief about the world. We come to the world believing that we are going to be able to comprehend it, that it's going to be comprehensible, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. So even with a
Yes.
figure like that, and then of course we have William of Ockham and his nominalism, which is to say that there are no essential categories of things. There are tables, but to say table in my mind, that's just a word. It's just a label I'm kind of inventing, a pattern that we develop. But then, of course, that leads you to deny things which we know and we behave as though objectively exist, like love and goodness and beauty and truth. Um,
Yeah.
and then one that I'm particularly interested in is, well, to a certain extent, there's Duns Scotus, but there's also Marsilius of Padua and their voluntarism. Because what happened then was this, as you say, modernity wants to fragment and categorize everything. Well, faith and reason became fragmented, and reason and our will became fragmented as well. And they wanted to really emphasize the primacy of will in God. Primarily, it started off as a theological idea, but then this filtered through into our conceptions of law and government. And so government began to be perceived in this more Machiavellian, we might say, way of being just an instrument of power, of asserting will, and this was arguably sort of proto-thinking for Hobbes's Leviathan, the modern state, which is
Yes.
purely about being the monopolization of violence and the one source of manipulative or coercive power in the world. I mean, I would tend to focus on those three thinkers in my kind of genealogy of how we got from the medieval world to where we are now, where
Yes.
where publicly don't acknowledge meaning and truth and value and belief and that sort of thing. Would you broadly agree with me?
Oh, very much. I'm glad you mentioned Abelard because he is um, undoubtedly one of the most brilliant thinkers of the Western tradition. Um, and brilliant people tend to have all sorts of impacts that maybe they didn't intend. So he brought logic to its much higher level than it had been beforehand, and totally sort of got stuck into a form of realism which was not logical. But in doing so, he invented theology as a science, which I think was an extremely bad idea. The science of God. Wow. That's asking too much. And the erosion of the transcendentalia, the erosion of participatory ontology really starts with Abelard. It starts very early. So the 14th century Franciscan trends you're talking about with William of Ockham and Duns Scotus, which are fundamental to the rise of modernity, particularly nominalism and voluntarism, have been kicking around for some time in the Middle Ages, since its beginning as a high academic movement, in a way, Aquinas is one of the last figures who really integrates an Augustinian ontology with the new Aristotelian science and logic. And that synthesis of those two trajectories, the Augustinian participatory ontology and the new logic and science of Aristotle, is so complex and delicate in Thomas that it almost falls apart almost immediately, right? and then we have great, like Ockerman, Scotus are brilliant thinkers. Like, let me, for supporters of these people, let me make it clear I have enormous respect for them as thinkers. But in trying to solve problems produced by a new appreciation of logic and a new appreciation of what they called it Greek necessitism, the sort of far end to logic which Abelard had already kind of signalled. They go in the opposite end and go for absurdism and voluntarism in a way that, you know, if this goes like if God wills it to be moral, it is, and that's all there is to it, right? And this tendency to this attempted epistemic closure on the nature of on the nature of ontology. Okay, so with Scotus univocity of being. So what is a huge question. What the meaning of being is almost meaningless to us now, after the sort of collapse of medieval metaphysics in the 17th century. So we, as moderns, we are impoverished to start with when it comes to ontology. And this is where I've learned so much from the Orthodox theologians, like the Greeks, you know. They never lost that trend. They never lost that line, particularly through Dionysius and the apophatic, the insistence on what you can't say, the importance of what you can't say, and a kind of a very existential, grounded understanding of the life of the church, the living in the life of Christ, like with Schmemann, you know, for the life of the world. This is something the West needs very strongly, and thinkers like Christos Gianaris, I don't know if you're familiar with his work, wonderful Greek guy, wonderful Greek theologian and sociologist. He comes across as rabidly anti-Western. He's not. He's anti-Greeks being Western. do you know what I mean? Can you see the difference?
Yes, I think I'm familiar with what you mean. Yeah.
So the preciousness of the Eastern Christian tradition is that it never had that ontological poverty that the West went through. And if the East tries to be West, it's all over. So Gianaris is very strong. Let's stay with our patristic strengths, and not just go full hog Western. And then we've got something we can actually give to the West that they need. So I see him as a very generous figure rather than an antagonistic figure. And I think we have to face that we are deeply impoverished ontologically because of those 14th century Franciscan moves to nominalism and voluntarism. And then we generate God as the central quality of God being will, then we're made in the image of God, and then you get Calvinism, then you've got modernity big time, and I've got many close Calvinist friends. I love them, and Calvin again is one of these great guys. But it's incredibly problematic because we don't understand what it means to participate in the life of God, because we don't have a concept of being in as an ontological concept. So we lost a lot of really key philosophical, theological anchor points in the 14th century, through the 14th century moves. And so by the time the Protestant Reformation happens, it's embedded in quite what I would understand quite dysfunctional ontology that was Roman Catholic at the time. Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk, right? Now, I even think, so I've got a great friend who's a Lutheran scholar, and he doesn't like the way that I talk about this because he thinks Luther actually is really Augustinian, and he really does have roots to those more Neoplatonist ontological categories. So I don't know Lutheranism well enough to really argue with my friend Knut. He's magic. But certainly Protestantism in general and this and the sort of 16th century atmosphere and move into the 17th century where a new kind of theology that's voluntarist, that's nominalist, is kind of assumed across the board, as much by Catholic thinkers like Galileo and Descartes as by Protestant thinkers. So you get the rise of a modern scientific culture, and Francis Bacon's a fascinating figure in this whole story, trying to put an eschatological angle on science. So we're going to solve the problems of the fall through an increase in knowledge. So our essential nature in God's image is not only to be willers, but to be knowers. And of course, the Augustinian idea that we are lovers and God is love is and we participate in his love is kind of backgrounded by this stage. And it becomes much more logically legalistic and much more instrumentally eschatological in focus. And it did a lot of great things, like, we wouldn't have modern science without it, but the gains come at a loss. The gains in sort of scientific knowledge come at a loss in metaphysical depth. And now metaphysics itself is meaningless to us. And we don't know what the real is, which leads me to plug my book again. This one I think is my best book, Returning to Reality. So what is the real? We've got to ask this question. And it's not just power and it's not virtuality. There is a real created order here. And it was created good, and we need to understand this better if we want to live well. Here endeth the rant.
There's so much for me to agree with and bounce off of there. Where should I start? Well, I mean, firstly, talking about, you mentioned before about Scotus and the idea of the univocity of being. I think you really did put it very well in the book. The way you described it, that before God would be perceived as something beyond being, so it's beyond material existence, which is constantly becoming and unbecoming, and it's transient, and where there are eternal forms, there are things which are eternally true. We can perceive them in our mind, and perhaps you could say mathematical principles, things like that, laws of various kinds. But even beyond that, there has to be some ground of being. But what Scotus has done is to say, well, no, that there is just being. I mean, it becomes, if you like, a kind of linear scale or spectrum even, and God is just kind of at the peripheries and the infinite, level of being, which we can't even understand anyway, really, can we? So that even that is kind of limiting. So I thought that was something you explained very well in the book. I just thought I had to mention it there.
On that point, Richard. So
yeah,
it really helped me a lot looking closely at Plato on this, because Scotus's idea of God as infinite being is is totally smashes the classical notion of being. Okay, so being must be finite because you can't define something if it's infinite. So for it to have an essence, it has to be a thing. So the idea that there can be a being that's infinite is to smash the categories with which classical ontology and Augustinian Christian ontology was built in. And it may seem like a storm in a teacup to say with Thomas, God is, what does Thomas say? I don't know. Thomas is quite Platonistic in this regard. God is being beyond being.
Yes.
Or to say that God is infinite being in Scotus. It seems like a storm in a teacup. It's not. It's an enormous distinction. So to Plato, of course, goodness beyond being is the grounds of all reality. And so that goodness beyond being, we in the Christian tradition would call God, right? Sure, we will never get God in a bottle. I can agree with Thomas. I can agree with Scotus. I can agree with anyone on that. However, in Thomas, the being of God is its own thing. There is no other category for that, right? Whereas with Scotus, the being of God, the being of horse poo, it's all the same word, right? And so if you don't have God as a category beyond being, then what's the source of essence within being? So the idea that things have an essential nature which is timeless, even though everything we experience is within the flux and contingency of the spatio-temporal manifold, right? But we wouldn't be able to know anything if that's all there was to it, because being is tied to knowing. Knowing is tied to being in classical ontology, right? So when Scotus smashes the concept of being, he liberates knowledge from being, and we get modernity as only interested in knowledge, and then all of a sudden nobody understands metaphysics anymore. Right? And there's a huge thing that happened, and I'm only just starting to notice this, but I don't know if you know Robert Pasnow.
No, I don't. This is very educational for me, this talk, you know.
You should know Robert.
Book recommendations.
I will recommend 2 books. This one is a thumping great thing, only for the brave.
Yeah, it looks it, yeah.
But this one, very, very helpful, because what happened to metaphysics between the 13th century and the 17th century? It's an enormous transition. Nobody knows about it because we think the medievals were stupid. Right? Us sophisticated modernists, right?
Yeah.
This one, much easier to read. I wonder if you can see that. After Certainty. It's about a history of our epistemic ideals and illusions by Robert Pasnow. Beautiful book. Beautiful book. So I really recommend Robert, because he, in his big thumping heavy one, I'm one of these freaks who's got time to just sit down with a heavy book for 3 months.
Bless you.
I don't get a lot of other things done.
Well, yeah, exactly. Oh, I'm much too busy with my young children. But if I have more time, if my reading list slims up a little bit, thank you for the recommendations. That's absolutely fantastic. I was thinking also what you were saying.
But let me say something about.
Oh, please go on.
Let me say something about Pasnow's understanding, because it will tie back to law as well. We'll come to that in a minute. But if you look at what happens from the 13th century to the 17th century in metaphysics, we lose Aristotle. We're losing him all the time. And even though that is the high age of Aristotle, okay, we are losing him because we are losing a Platonist metaphysics. And I don't know if you know of Lloyd Gerson. Do you know of this classical scholar
I've heard of him. I can't say that
I've... this one. Plato and other Aristotle and Other
Ah,
Platonists
fantastic. Yes.
by Lloyd P. Gerson.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. So Aristotle has a Platonist metaphysics. Right? The idea that you can oppose Aristotle to Plato is one of the huge fallacies of I don't know, the last 1,000 years. uh, but so Aristotle's got this wonderful way of understanding matter and form as always together. Now he doesn't think you can have form outside of matter, and Plato and I and the patristic scholars do. Right? But the way in which matter and form get separated over the 16th century, leading up to the 16th century, through an erosion of ontology, through that Scotus move and other moves, prepares the ground for the return of Democritus. Are you familiar with Democritus, the ancient atomist?
Yes, the atomist. Okay. That's right. Yes.
So Democritus is the huge guy who comes in through Gassendi in the 17th century, and we're all atomists now. We all think there is only atom, motion, and void. That's what reality is, right? So we've got no understanding of essence or purpose or cause. So we lose immediately half of Aristotle's causes. And this revolution in metaphysics that happens in the 17th century is much bigger than the revolution in knowledge in terms of upheaving. But that just goes on bubbling under the surface. And then as science becomes more and more instrumentally impressive, right, it becomes a thing with a metaphysics, and it's got a Democritean metaphysics. And we don't have any concept of essence or purpose in the world anymore. And we've lost it. We've lost the world we actually live in, right? Our minds can't grasp the world as we actually experience it. So love, purpose, meaning, goodness, beauty, truth. We live in this world. This is the real world, but we've got no mind concepts, no knowledge concepts that can grasp it anymore. So really recommend Pasnow and Gerson in understanding these things.
Yes, they look like fantastic books. I'm sure I'd end up agreeing with them and learning a huge amount from them as well. The other thing I wanted to continue on from what you said before was it does seem that after Aquinas, and I mean Aquinas really upheld and defended the classical, more Platonistic view of things, obviously including being, as you've just explained. It seems that after him, I mean, you have figures like you mentioned Francis Bacon, for instance, and I mean, interestingly, he was influenced by some Gnostics of his time, and so it's hardly surprising then with these nominalistic ideas, these other things, this kind of misunderstanding of Aristotle, or overemphasizing the sort of, what can I say, the non-Platonistic or the less Platonistic ideas in Aristotle. It really took hold, and I mean, it was only with Aquinas that we can go back and we can see, okay, here's really a very strong classical defense of the idea that if matter didn't have any forms informing it, I mean, it wouldn't have any comprehensible form. It wouldn't have any shape. It wouldn't have any meaning like that. And
you wouldn't be able to know it.
Yes, yeah. Yes. If I can just have a quick aside before we move on. You mentioned about Luther. You mentioned about Luther. Some would say potentially he's a very Augustinian thinker, and so he would be trying to hearken back to that more Christian Platonist view of the world. Is it true that Luther was himself a nominalist, and so he wouldn't, he would have agreed with Occam, let's say, and in saying that there were no essential categories, so we can't actually identify, what can I say, beauty or something like that. I find that some Catholics in particular will emphasize Luther as being nominalistic. What are your thoughts on that? Just briefly.
Okay. Okay. I have a very good friend, Knut Alsvag. He's a Norwegian theologian, Lutheran Norwegian theologian. Um, I trust his judgment very much on these matters. And the people who give me reason to think he really is right, Knut, Hamann and Kierkegaard, were good Lutherans. So I'll unpack this a little bit. I don't know enough. See, Knut would say, okay, Luther's a nominalist, but what does Luther mean by his nominalism? And so the kind of nominalist he might be, I don't really understand, I'm not a Lutheran. I refer you to Knut. But I do know that Luther gets a very bad rap in many of the radical Orthodox and sort of ressourcement Catholic thinkers that I know. And I don't think it's really fair with my long discussions with Knut, but I don't know the Lutheran position well enough to really give you a good answer. So if I can find Knut's book, where is it?
We might need the book. I think everyone, not myself, of course, would have some difficulty Googling that name. The spelling may be a little bit...
It's Knut, K-N-U-T, this is his first name, and Alsvag is L-A-L-F-S-V-A-G with an O over the A, or a double A.
Simple.
Alsvag.
Simple.
But
no, that's fine.
This is so annoying. I've recently reorganized my library. Bad move. Oh, that's annoying. That is so annoying. Where I couldn't.
Don't worry about it. We can put it in some show notes. A link to the book, so people will be able to.
Yeah, well, it's done a beautiful book on Nicholas of Cusa, Maximus the Confessor, and Martin Luther, and he says you can tie these together very deeply in the Lutheran tradition. Now, Knut's an outsider. There are many Lutherans who wouldn't do that. But I think he's right. You can do that. There is a way in which Lutheranism is a part of the Catholic tradition that Knut would have no problem with that sort of description. So the church is a complicated big animal.
Absolutely. I mean, that leads into the point I was just about to make. I wanted to finish by addressing what you were saying about your Greek friend, and speaking about some things that they hadn't lost in the East, that in the West, with the rise of these ideas that we've been talking about and the rise of modernity, we have lost, and sadly, even so many among the church, even with notable ranks, bishops, etc., even they would be swept up, in this sense that there is only science. If a scientist has come on television and said it, well, that's it. We don't need to do any more thinking, which is absurd for a number of reasons we don't necessarily need to go into. Although I will say, just the sentence alone, I will say this often to some atheist friends, the sentence alone, the scientific method is a means of arriving at truth. I will say, can you prove that sentence using the scientific method? And of course you can't. There's other thinking that needs to go on. There's reason and beliefs and assumptions you have to make, all sorts of things. Anyway, so getting back to this point of the divergence between the East and the West, I do see in Radical Orthodoxy, and I do see in returning to thinkers like Augustine, returning back to Aquinas and addressing him, not in the sense that the neo-Thomists will address him, which I find often doesn't seem to be saying exactly what Aquinas says, or is a kind of detraction from the more Platonistic elements of Aquinas, which John Milbank and Catherine Pigstock have done a fantastic job of redressing. So I see him thinking like that, and of course you just mentioned this chap Knut, who's trying to say things are not quite so black and white. You cannot look at these figures in history, even if it's Occam, even if it's Duns Scotus, and say, oh, he's the bad guy, and this was the truth. You've got to deal with it. You've got to try and understand what they were thinking. What's the context of the language that they were using? Otherwise, you can end
Yes.
up talking past each other. And I do see that there is
Yes.
a great deal of the discourse between, what should we say, Western Christendom and Eastern Christendom, where it's semantics, and it's just not meaning the same things by the words that are being used, and we just end up talking past each other. And it's like that with Protestant friends I have as well. I find actually, once we really get down to it, we find that we agree. Really, it's just the language that we're
Yes.
using and the negative connotations we've developed around it, whereby we paint a negative image of the other in our minds. So, what can I say? Would you agree with me then that in the work that you're doing in Radical Orthodoxy, in this discourse, there is scope for a potential, not just getting past the problems of modernity, but also in reuniting Christendom in a way, at least, if not politically or what have you, but certainly in a spiritual sense?
Definitely, I'm a huge fan of the small c Catholic. Just the Greek word, all inclusive. So, and I think philosophical theology has made it possible for a new type of small c Catholicism across the traditional institutional divides. So, in my project, I have, David Bentley Hart, Soterius Mitralexis. I've got Orthodox theologians. I've got John Milbank, who's probably in a class of his own, and the Anglo-Catholics, the Catholics, William Desmond, David Schindler, Michael Hamby. I've got Anglicans like me. There's people who are trying to think about meaning and theology in a public way rather than a discreetly religious way, are coming together from all different ecclesial traditions. And it's very hopeful. It's very, I don't know what's going to happen with institutions. A good friend of mine who's an Anabaptist, I don't know if you know too many Anabaptists, he's got this fantastic reading of the, this is not as anti-Catholic as it sounds, okay? But he's got this fantastic reading of the parable of the sower. Okay, so in the parable of the sower, the Lord throws out the sower throws out the seed, and the birds come down and pick it off the path. Then Jesus explains, well, the birds are the devil, right? And then the next parable is the parable of the mustard seed, and the mustard seed grows like a huge bush, almost like a tree, and the birds of the air come and rest on the top. and my friend Dave, who's kind of an anarchist, says, what do you think that means? Okay, so I don't have a lot of faith in institutional power structures in whatever church, although I think we need them, right? But it is a truism in the scriptures that the Spirit blows where it will, and our attempts to construct religious safeties, which are important and necessary, and God blesses them, and they can go horribly wrong, are unavoidable. And I believe in an embodied institutional church. I don't believe in some disembodied thing in the sky. But I think trying to make sense of the fragmentations and dysfunctions of modernity, its anomia and its pragmatic directionlessness. People who are thinking philosophically and theologically together coming across from all areas of the church, and it's very exciting.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's very interesting. Um, I said that I would keep you for just 1 hour, and I think our time is pretty much up now. I don't want to overstay my welcome, but I would like. I mean, you've plugged so many books already, but I mean, is there somewhere that people can find you following this conversation? I mean, you have an academia.edu page, I believe, which has a number of your articles there. What sources can people use to find you?
Yeah, that's probably the easiest way. If you just type Paul Tyson into a Google search, it'll probably come up at the University of Queensland, and I've got a page there. Yeah. But I just want to give one plug for one more book. So Pieper, do you know Joseph Pieper? Okay, so his understanding of Thomism, I think, is the beautiful one. Which has this rich understanding of the apophatic and the Platonist in Thomas. So it's not a neo-Thomist view, and I don't know neo-Thomism well enough, but when I read Pieper on Plato, it just comes alive, and on Thomas. So read Pieper more than me, but I'm okay too.
Sure. Thank you so much for all the book recommendations as well. That's fantastic, and obviously, before you buy anything else, I heartily recommend that you go and buy this book, or even what was the book that you said you thought was your best book again, Paul?
It's Returning to Reality. It's my defense of Christian Platonism for our times.
Excellent.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me, Richard. It's been wonderful to chat.
It's been an absolute pleasure personally, even if this was not for anyone else's benefit. I benefited a huge amount, I think. My reading list is now far too long. I can't thank you for that. But
we didn't even start talking about law.
We didn't even get on to law. But
law some other time.
Maybe another time. It's all connected, though, really, isn't it? I suppose we did address the modern state. I suppose that's pretty key. Perhaps for another time. Yeah, so once again, thank you so much, Paul. It's been a real pleasure.
Wonderful, Richard. Thank you.